Hi, I'm Jennifer Woosley Saylor. I'm a licensed professional clinical counselor and the kid of a cop. And this is the podcast When the Call Hits Home.
Hey everyone, it's Ashley Gethner. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and I'm also a child of a police officer.
Welcome back to When the Call Hits Home. I'm Jennifer Woosley Saylor, and I think today might be a really special episode definitely a first for me. So I have a special guest to me. So why don't you just tell everybody who you are?
My name is Jim Woosley, and I, over the years, had many titles. One of them was police officer, but one of my proudest titles was parent and father of Jennifer Woosley.
You're going to get us emotional out of the gate. Okay. Well, so today's episode is with my dad. So I was jealous that Ashley got to interview her dad. And so, we know you're like your son and very busy, important. It's hard to nail you down to schedule something, but we get to meet today and talk a little bit about your experience as a first responder and your experience as a parent. And I guess I have you to thank for why this podcast exists. So if you weren't a first responder, this wouldn't. And it's about ready to be Thanksgiving. So the thankful season. So thank you for that. My first question that you say I have the answer to, but I honestly don't, is what was your trajectory to become a first responder? How did you decide to do this for a living?
Well, I got as a young man, I had no idea what I wanted to do, and I got the opportunity to serve in the military in the early 70s. Vietnam was going on, and I got drafted and ended up in Vietnam with no idea what I wanted to do with my career or life. I did have at the time, I didn't graduate, but I did have a few years of college. And most people won't remember this, people younger, but there was an author named Joseph Wambaugh, who was a police sergeant with the LAPD. And he was an author and wrote several books, and he had a TV series or two. When I was in Vietnam, I started reading some of his books, and I thought, about police work and being a police officer. And they, in his books, they seemed to have a good time. I thought that'd be a nice job. I might want to try to do that. So when I was in Vietnam, I thought that might be a career. And I come back from Vietnam. I was still in the Army, and I got stationed at Fort Meade, Maryland. And I managed to talk my way into the MPs there. MP wasn't my primary MOS, but coming back to Vietnam, they give me a little leadway. And so my last year in the military, I worked as an MP officer at Fort Meade, Maryland. I got out of the Army, and when I got out, I took classes while I was in the Army at Fort Meade. And I got out of the Army. I didn't like my semester graduating. So I stayed up in Maryland and graduated from the University of Maryland. But while I was out there, I managed to apply and get a job with the Bladensburg, Maryland Police Department. So my first civilian job was in law enforcement was the Bladensburg, Maryland Police Department, which is a small community about a mile or two out just north of Washington, D.C. But that's where I got my start.
In becoming an MP and your experience being an officer there, did you think that the book was true? The Choir Boys, was that a pretty true story?
Well, I'm not sure about that, but coming on the Louisville Police Department several years later, I don't want to tell any stories because the statute of limitations might not be up.
Right.
But we did have some good times, and I did enjoy my time as a police officer.
Well, I'll jump into the mental health aspect because, Ashley and I we do that for a living, but I think back then you would call that blowing off steam.
Well, go back to Joseph Wambaugh. He had a book called The Choir Boys.
Yes.
And we had some choir practices.
Mm-hmm.
That was the term that they used when they were going to choir practice, when they would get off work and go out and have maybe alcohol beverage or two and tell some more stories and all. And we were real good at that. We did that on a semi-regular basis.
Yeah, I think we might reframe and rebrand that into like reprocessing and maybe some time together to kind of talk about your shifts, like minus maybe some of the alcohol is probably a good use of your time after a shift.
Well, yes, I agree with you. I don't suggest you use the alcohol as maybe as we did as much, but the sessions were stress relievers. They were, we bonded, we felt each other's problems and stories, and we laughed over it, had good times. But it was a stress reliever. I don't want to jump ahead, but later I worked overseas for several years as a police officer contractor for the UN. And to do that, you had to go through a little training, and then you had to do some PT, and you had to do several things. But one thing you had to do, you had to talk to a psychiatrist, and and we talked, and I was talking to one time, and I'd done this several times, and he said, I know one thing said another. We got to talk about the military and the PSD in the military being seemed like a lot worse. And he was talking that in World War II, people went to war, and when they came back, sorry, PTSD, yes, sorry. But when they came back, they got on ships, and they all came back together, and it took them 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, a couple of months maybe. But in that time, they did that kind of. They sat around, they talked, they told each other problems, and they told of the stress they've been in, and they related to each other, and they were kind of self-counseling. He said, starting with Vietnam. I was in Vietnam. I was there a year, and I got on a plane, and 12 hours later, I was home. So we didn't get to do that, and the wars since then have not done that, and I don't know if it's there's more PTSD today, or we just know more about it. But the World War II and earlier veterans, I'm sure they suffered it, but they kind of treated themselves, I believe.
Yeah. Well, I definitely think that there's something in camaraderie and being able to share and talk about your experience. And maybe the alcohol made the stories funnier when you met, they made for better stories.
Yes, yes. Yeah. Just like alcohol time, the stories get better as we go on.
So how long were you a police officer before you became a parent?
7 years. You ought to know this. You were there, but
Yes,
I was on 7 years. I made sergeant, and I had a little ceremony in the district, and you were there, and you were about 2 weeks old.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So I'm sure you remember it well.
I do. Did becoming a parent change anything about being? I mean, it changes everything about your life. Let's not pretend that, because I'm a parent. But in terms of any difference with your career once you became a parent?
Yeah, your priorities changed a little bit. The choir practices didn't become as regular, and
I didn't get to go hang out there.
You had other responsibilities and had other things to do. So I don't know if being a parent or maybe just maturing and getting a little older, but they went hand in hand. So yeah, it changed your view and the way your outlook on things.
Yeah, I don't know. My brother and I might say that you still went to those, because we had quite a few times at the FOP lodge where we were waiting on you.
Well, you learned how to play pool.
Oh, yeah, it's really good at pool thanks to those choir practices, for sure. Anything else that you wanted to say in regards to that?
No, I don't think so.
So obviously the priorities change when you become a parent. Was there anything in your experience that you think was maybe made you a different parent because of what you did for a living?
Yeah, as a police officer, a firefighter, EMS, when you're making calls for service, and one of the calls that always bothered me, and I'm sure it bothers all of us, is Sid's death. So that affects how you look on your family and your kids and all. You're always worried about, and that's something that there's nothing you can do about it. I mean, you go to bed and that happens, but that was always a call that I hated, and it just didn't seem right.
Well, it doesn't. My mom tells a story. I think I was a newborn, and she had put me in my crib and just having what we would call now postpartum. I think she called it baby blues. That's how old I am. But she became a little emotional and started weeping and said she heard you run up the stairs and run into the nursery and immediately check me to see if I was breathing before. And it startled her, like, wait, what are you doing? But when you make a call like that,
Yeah.
I'm sure it's, watching your baby breathe is something that you kind of become super aware of. Well, I'll tell a story about you as a parent being a first responder. Well, before I do that, tell us not your whole CV resume, but give us just a little bit. So 7 years in, you became a sergeant, and then tell us a little bit more about what you did in your career, and save your second career a little bit for the end, your overseas work.
Okay. I was 7 years old. Had 7 years old when I made sergeant. Those first seven, I did like most officers do. I spent the first 4 or so in patrol, riding the beat. And I was a district detective for a little while. And I made sergeant and moved. I was a desk sergeant for about 6 months. It's just kind of a policy that we put new sergeants in the radio room. And I went to the second district, was the downtown area. And primarily down there, most of my time, I had the walking beats, which was a business area in downtown Louisville. And then the 4th and 5th platoons, which was extra platoons. And I was there for about 10 years, I guess. And made sergeant, and I was a sergeant then. I went to homicide. I spent 5 years as a homicide sergeant. And I went to robbery, spent 5 years in robbery, which time I really enjoyed the robbery time. And then after that, I was fortunate enough to make lieutenant, and I was a lieutenant for a few years before I retired.
Tell me why you like robbery so much. I remember why you told me this.
In robbery, it was basically whodunits, and they were all bad guys. They used to joke that in homicide there was some people deserved to get killed, but nobody deserved to be robbed, So and there was no domestic killings; they were all kind of whodunits, and I really just enjoyed robbery. You're really looking for bad guys.
Well, I'm glad you took us to robbery, because that's what I wanted to talk about. So I was probably in middle school, high school. And we were up there probably at the police gym, because that's where we spent all FOP or police gym. That's where my childhood was. But I think we were leaving and somebody was being held, like getting ready to be interrogated. And the person was a professional or former professional athlete, I think a football player. Do you remember this?
Maybe.
So he was a professional athlete and he was being interrogated and charged with a robbery. And maybe there were some concerns about there had been a homicide that he might know some details about. And you told my brother and I, that's what drugs will do to you. He was on top of the world, a professional athlete. Can you imagine, getting to do something you love like that? And here he was in a police headquarters getting ready to be interviewed. And I do think that, in terms of the power of what drugs will make you give up. So that was a good lesson as a first responder parent.
I remember that, and I think you're exaggerating a little. I don't think it was a professional athlete. I think it was a University of Louisville football player. In Louisville, that is a professional athlete. We don't get no better than that. But he was a UFL football player, and he was drafted by Atlanta, the Falcons.
There we go. So he wasn't a liar.
But he was he was really a nice guy, and he was begging to be caught. He robbed a place and then called a taxi cab to take him home. So being the good detectives we were able to figure that out, and we got him. And he was wanting to get caught, and he said that first time he did drugs, he knew it was his drug of choice, and he was addicted after one time he used it, and it was a good lesson for young kids, I think.
Yeah, that's so sad.
Yes, it was. And he was. It was sad.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about your second career. We're gonna jump around a little bit.
I was lucky that I had a good second career. I retired after 30 years I retired from Louisville Metro Police. I spent majority of that time with the old Louisville City Police. But on retirement, I went to work as a contractor it was a contractor through the State Department, but basically he's a policeman for the UN. And I got to go to, I did that for about almost 10 years, I guess. But that 10 years, I'd worked maybe 6 or 7 years. You'd work a year and a half and take off a year and go back. But I was able to go to Liberia in West Africa first, which is really a learning experience. Talk about poor people and not having anything. This time of Thanksgiving, we really should be thankful. They had very little, and they were happy with what they had. They were
very grateful,
very grateful. And then, and I also went to Kosovo in Europe. I did that twice, and then I ended up in Jordan in the Middle East. Ended up going there twice, training and teaching Palestinian police who'd come over from Israel or Gaza, and we trained them over there for 3 or 4 months, and then they'd go back.
So I definitely was the benefactor of you living overseas. So I got to see quite a bit of things thanks to that.
We did. One thing that the police department did for us, we got to do a lot of traveling, and I said we, as a family, it seemed like all of our family vacations were based around the police department, where we went to FOP conventions. I was involved in the FOP, and we have a convention every 2 years, and they were family friendly. So we went to Orlando and Phoenix and Oklahoma and other places. So our vacations were pretty much police related.
Well, I remember our FOP convention in Louisville, Kentucky, and we still got to stay at the Hyatt. So we were big time, to be in our own backyard and get to stay at the fancy hotel. No, I mean, I think all our vacations are around that, which again, I think is talking more about the community or the brotherhood. We had this conversation before, but I think it's a good thing to bring up for the podcast. You retired after how many years?
That's 30 on the
30 years. And then you retired, and I don't know, 2 weeks later went to Liberia?
Actually, I was supposed to leave before I retired. I came back a time or two, so I won't bore you with that story. But actually, I took a vacation to leave and give a friend of mine, a sergeant, power of attorney, so he'd retire for me. But while I was training, some things changed, and I got to come back a time or two. I ended up retiring and turning my gun and badge and everything in. And I came back the third time, and I was going to stay another couple of weeks instead of taking vacation. I went back to work. I went down to the property room and got a badge and all. So I worked another 2 weeks. So actually, I worked up to the day I left.
Well, and sadly, there's a lot about suicide rates increase for first responders after retirement. Talk a little bit about, maybe what your experience was different for you.
Well, I was lucky there because I fell into another job, another career, and I really enjoyed. I got to go a lot of places. Most of them weren't very nice. I mean, they were places that were at war or had been at war, and the political situation was good, and there was a lot of unrest. But I got to work with a lot of police from all over the world. And I mean, all over the world. And I got to work with some really good ones. And like everywhere else, a few that wasn't so good. But I really enjoyed bonding and working and seeing different lifestyles and different ways of doing things from police from Europe, China, Philippines, Africa, just everywhere you can imagine. Made a lot of good friends, and I fortunately I got to several of them. I've gone to their home and countries all over the world, and and I've had some visit me here, and still got communicate with friends and all.
Those lucky ones that got to come to Kentucky.
Yeah, they all of them had some German and some Chinese, and I think all of them really enjoyed it.
Tell the story about being in Liberia and doing the census and finding out some local names. You remember that story?
No, I don't remember that.
I'll use the punchline if I tell you that. Well, we'll have to come back to that one. But I mean, I think it's hard to retire and not have anything to do.
Well, like I said, it wasn't an issue for me because I kind of got out and jumped right back in the deep end.
What recommendations would you give for people retiring then?
I have a plan, and it doesn't have to go back to work full time, but have an interest, a hobby, a job, a plan to keep you active and keep you busy and keep you social. Don't just go sit in your room and become a hermit, because I think that causes some people problems. We are social animals, and we need to be
We are herd animals, that's for sure. That's for sure. And actually, I think that's Ashley and I's goal a little bit here at the podcast, is just saying, hey, there's a community. So talk a little bit more about parenting. Do you feel like that there was any impact of what you did for a living in your family?
I don't think being a police officer affected our family that much. And when I say that, I mean things like holidays. You got to work on holidays. But I don't think, and you may correct me on this, but our family suffered much because of that. Most Christmases, I was there, and the one thing I did miss, and I don't think you missed much, but for about 5 years, when I was talked about it in the second district downtown area, they had a light up Louisville on Friday after Thanksgiving. Well, you all would go to your grandparents' home, which is about 80 miles away, and I could never go to that because I always had to work on a Friday. But that wasn't a big sacrifice, I don't think.
That's one thing I don't think that I'm like that you weren't present in terms of holidays and things like that. I didn't really remember you not being there. I remember one basketball game you didn't come to, and I called you from a payphone to tell you about it. It's a county school I went to, and you needed to know all the details. That's about the only ball game you ever missed.
I don't hope some of my old bosses don't hear this, because I might have been some places I shouldn't have been sometime at a ball game or a
but in uniform.
Yeah.
Making sure everybody was safe. So you said that you didn't think there was much impact being a first responder on the family.
Well, I mean, you said a lot of stuff we did was around the police department, around the FOP. A lot of the friends were in the same similar situation, but you all had your school friends and you had your neighborhood friends. So you just didn't grow up around just first responders kids. You had your other friends.
Well, what about for you? That was actually my question where I couldn't think of it. So, you mentioned that in terms of having a hobby. And so what was your hobby? What was your kind of social life outside of first responding?
Well, I become a pretty big, I got into running for physical fitness on the police department. I did a little training for the police in that area, but that was kind of my hobby and all. And I got officiated. I'm still officiating track and field, still enjoyed it. And I still do quite a little bit of that. But that's another thing we did. Seemed like every 2 years they had this World Police and Fire Games. But I started doing that in the early 90s and enjoyed it. And every 2 years to come up and I'd work pretty hard for it. And we got some good trips out of that.
I've seen Stockholm, Sweden, because you went to the World Police
and
Fire Games.
It was every 2 years, and it seemed like you and your brother would fight and argue who'd get to go. And like you got the good year, you went to Stockholm, and I think you got to go to Vancouver. You both lucked out pretty good. We went to Barcelona.
You go to Barcelona.
And then after Barcelona, it was in Indianapolis. And I think I had to make both of you go. Neither one of you want to go to Indianapolis.
We've
It was
been there a time or two.
100 miles away.
Well, we're probably traumatized from all the IU track meets you made us work as children. So yeah, but no, all kidding aside, but I think you definitely had your outlet in running and sports, which is a pretty healthy outlet to have outside of being a first responder.
Yeah, I think so. I feel like it. I feel like it's helped me get through some situations and something I still enjoy.
So, the question comes back to, do you feel like it impacted your family? And so I appreciate you can name some positive impacts in terms of getting to go to FOP trips and conventions, and then, World Track and Field Games, and those were beneficials, and some important lessons in life of saying, hey, choices you make impact your whole life. Those are all positives. Is there anything that you feel like was any kind of negative impact?
I remember one incident, and it may not impacted you and your brother as much as it did your mother. But I was in homicide at the time. It was about Christmas time. We found a body of a newborn in a area around the mall. Well, it was an unknown, a Jane nobody. So we were trying to figure out, first of all, who it was, who the mother was. And we got some tips and all. We got a tip on this one, and we go interview her and bring her in and talk to her. And she finally says, yeah, it wasn't hers, but she'd had a baby and she buried it in her backyard. So we go out and dig up the yard and find it. And about that time, the local news media is doing a story on us and homicide, and they're interviewing me. And this wasn't probably the smartest thing I ever did, but they asked me something about problems at home and problems with work. And I said, my wife talked, she was a store manager. She managed a pretty good department store. And I said, well, when you're digging up dead babies, you're not really too concerned about what your spouse's work problems are. And that was probably not a good thing to say. And I feel bad, and that could be why I'm divorced today. That's not the reason, but it might have helped some.
I think that's impactful to say that, it definitely gives perspective about other people's experiences and trying to walk through that, because I've said this before, I work with some people and we're talking about life or death with clients, and other people, they're talking about their inbox, their email inbox is really full. And, that can be hard to oh my goodness, that's not a big deal. And yet that is their reality. That is a stressful thing to have a really full inbox. So how do you maneuver through that?
Well, like when people call the police or the fire or any first responder, it's probably the biggest thing in their life. And when you get there and it's a routine, it's a run, a call you made 3 times that day, it's not that big a deal to you, but to them, it's huge. So you got to work with them and understand that their priorities and yours are not the same, but it's important to them, and you need to take care of their issues.
Yeah. Well, I do think that that's hard. I mean, do you ever think that, well, I'll share my experience. I do think sometimes you came home pretty irritable. But if you saw 2 dead babies in a day, I imagine that. So, but how do families maneuver through that? Because as a kid, I don't know that. And I don't know that I should know that as a kid.
No, you shouldn't. And we as parents should be more understanding. Probably it's our responsibility and not the kids' responsibility. We need to be more sympathetic and leave your problems at the door, which sounds good, but that's hard to do.
It is really hard to do. And I think, to circle back to you sitting in Vietnam and reading this book about the choir boys, and which reference for people that are listening, the choir boys is a book. They say they're going to choir practice, but they're going to a parking lot and drinking beer. That's the premise of the book. No spoilers for the book that was, written in the 70s. But I think you're coming back to, let's look at the benefits in those things. Like there are some positives in that, to come together, to have a place to say I'm not alone and that it's been a hard day or that was really crummy. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
And then, I think moving our bodies is important. I think your exercise was a place that was healthy for you to kind of, move some of that stuff along in our body. So I think that there's positives in that. And I appreciate you taking that responsibility to say, as parents, it is our job. And man, that can be really hard when you have a really stressful job. And I think it requires a lot of front loading. We kind of talked about that in an episode we just recorded, how important it is. And this is, you are not a firefighter, but I know what to do if this house catches on fire. And that's not because I have a firefighter, because you're not a firefighter. And I've never been in a building that's ever caught fire before. However, we do fire drills when there's no fire. So I think whatever we can do in positive ways to really front load healthy things, like a healthy hobby, something that we enjoy as a family together. I have a 5-year-old. The reason that you still like me is because I gave you a grandson, and we've done some game night. And it reminds me, we played games when we were a kid. Remember that? We would have a game night. So I think that there was things that you guys did to kind of, give us a connection as parents.
Well, I hope so. I think one thing I'm proud of, you and your brother both are still active physically and work out and run, and that's part of his routine in life. And he's, of course, military, which I guess he still has to, but I'm proud of that influence I left on you.
Well, I think it's important to think of yourself. We're not just our brains, we're not just our body. It's the whole, seeing ourselves holistically, mind, body, spirit is important. So I think having both those, yeah. This is my last official question. You've done a great job. I haven't put you on the spot too much, have I? What parenting wisdom would you pass on to a parent who happens to be a first responder?
Oh, sometimes and I think more so than most, but you say every job, sometimes we put a job before anything else. And maybe we ought to step back a little bit. Maybe our family ought to have a little higher priority and give it a little higher place. Like I said, I tried to do that, and maybe I did it sometime at the expense of the police department, as I'm about to come to some of your ball games working.
So there's still some bad guys on the streets because you came to my ball game.
But I tried to make every ball game that you or your brother, either one, had.
Well, let me tell you this, because I think that's a beautiful point. And I'll tell you a personal story, and you tell me if you can relate at all. So I, became a mom, and I took my maternity leave, and I went back to work, and I was kind of looking forward to going back to work. And of course, it was hard to have our son, and he was the best thing ever. But I was like, looking forward to going back to work. And then I was enjoying being back at work, and I reflected a little bit, and I'm like, man, I really am happy to be back at work. And it hit me, because you've been a police officer for 7 years. I'd been a therapist for several years before becoming a mom. I knew what to do as a therapist. I was like, I got this. I've been doing this long enough. I know where to file the papers. I know where to make the copies. I know how to sit and be present for people. I don't know anything about being a parent. And it really kind of hit me like, it's kind of hard sometimes to kind of, I want to lean into things I'm good at, and I get instant feedback, and you definitely don't get that as a parent, do you?
That's you know my mistake as a parent, but you learn from it. Your
Well,
brother,
yeah,
I knew a bit more by the time he got here. I remember one time you were a couple of weeks old, 3 or 4, and we had a 2-story house, and your mother, for the first time, I think, left me alone with you. I think
this is being recorded.
she finally trusted me enough to leave me alone with you, and I gave you a bath, got you out, and it was laid you on a landing by the steps, had you laying on towels, drying you off, and I needed another towel. Stand up and reach to get another towel out of the bathroom, and you rolled down the steps, which is about 10 or 12 steps, and you rolled all the way down. Fortunately, they weren't padded. You were crying and all, and I didn't know what to do. I did call EMS, and the EMS comes and looks at you, and they say, "Well, I think she's okay. Maybe stop crying." But then, so I didn't take you to the hospital or nothing, but I didn't know what to do there with you.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you called in the cavalry instead of just think that you could handle it by yourself.
I knew to call professional help.
Yeah. Well, we were talking about the difference of being a first responder parent. I did bust my lip open once at the track, and we weren't sure about stuff. And so we got in your squad car, and you're like, I don't know. And we were going to go to the hospital, maybe. It was before they had urgent care. And you saw EMS pulling into McDonald's, and you pulled them over. You put your sirens on and pulled the EMS truck over to make them look at me and make sure, does she need stitches or not? So the benefit, I don't think you had to pay a copay for that either. We didn't get charged an ambulance fee for you saying, hey, does my 8-year-old need stitches? So yeah.
Said the job didn't pay much, but had some benefits.
Well, and I definitely think that I can see that. Like, I definitely see the benefits of you being a first responder for sure. So, well, I appreciate you letting me interview you. Anything else that you want to tell when the call hits home?
Well, no, just tell you that I think you and Ashley are doing a good job, and I'm proud of both of you.
Well, I appreciate that. And again, we wouldn't be able to do this podcast if it wasn't for you and her dad. So you guys know Ashley always does this best, but when the call hits home, Ashley and I are here for you. Thank you.